to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. This podcast is sponsored by YakkerTech, softball's first in-game optical tracking system and most accurate data capturing solution. Hi everyone, welcome to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. This is our very own Carly Sewell, our head strength coach here at S2. This is Series 2, Episode 2. If you joined us for Episode 1, hopefully you did, we talked about how this next series of Redefine the Circle is all about the systems that you and I have worked to create to make sure that the strength floor and the bullpen or the pitching training environment are walking hand in hand, are super cohesive. So all about strength and conditioning for pitchers. Episode 1 was awesome. I'm excited for Episode 2 here. Carly, welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay, so today let's get into a little bit more detail. Episode 1 was a lot. So we covered a lot of topics, but we just kind of kept it surface level to really give pitching coaches just an understanding and to kind of spark their brains regarding, like, what are the things that I should be expecting of my strength coach? What are the types of things that I want to make sure that my strength coach is doing? Are they, if I take my pitcher into her workout or I'm watching what she's doing in her program, does it look similar to, a male athlete of another sport? Like, how can I make sure that our strength floor is also evolving the way we as pitching coaches are also working to evolve? So that was Episode 1. It was a great discussion. Today, let's get into a little bit more specifics about our system. And we talked about when you first came on board to S2 Breakthrough, a handful of years ago, we had to just kind of jump in, as we do with anything, and build bad systems in order to eventually build good systems, right? And so they're ever evolving, but we certainly have gotten to a point where we feel like a high level of confidence in what we're doing. So let's explain that process a little bit. So let's talk assessments. That is the heart of what we do here. Obviously, when we talk about building programs and building systems for our athletes, the very first piece that we have to establish is an understanding of their story. I think of it as like they've got all these puzzle pieces and we want to know exactly which one connects to the other. And we want to slowly be able to build like the greatest puzzle we can here for this athlete. And so understanding their whole story. And now when I talk about assessments, I think it's important, and I think probably most people listening to this podcast kind of have an idea of what our assessment process looks like, but we're not just talking like mobility. It's a mobility portion, which is obviously very important. What we call movement capacity, which is kind of like the heart of what the assessment really tells us. It's like, how stable is the athlete? When does the trunk start to lose its stability, break down? When do they start to rely on compensations to do the work? Of course, expressions of power will measure, and then biomechanics. So it's like movement all the way from everything outside the motion, all the way up into how that movement capacity plays out and comes together within the motion. So we really have a good idea of like, what can this athlete do and not do in the current moment, right? So what I would say is, first and foremost, can you tell us, we deliver an initial assessment to an athlete, tell me what information you get. So I always joke with you and say, like, Carly, like, you don't know anything about the pitching motion, but you know so much about the pitching motion, right? Like you couldn't get into the pitching cage or a bullpen and like train pitching. Yet, by our assessment, because we've built an assessment that really helps to show how the body needs to be able to move in order to really maximize the pitching motion, you know so much about the pitching motion, right? So tell me, I have a pitcher, I'm like, Car, let's get to work, let's build her program. Here's her assessment. What are the types of things that you get from that? What are the types of things that you see and you learn from?
So the first thing I'm looking at in that assessment is her mobility. So that mobility is going to cover how she's compensating in rotation. if something is limited on mobility, that's probably what she's buying that rotation from, or it's very restricted because a joint above or below it is buying that rotation, and it's not actually coming from the middle. So mobility is where the compensations are happening. And then movement capacity, which, like you said, it is a heart and soul. It is the thing we are most proud of here. And when it comes down to it, softball is all about trunk stability. How much can you resist movement in your trunk and maintain that while going through the motion? And so our movement capacity is tailored to that. It's where the trunk breaks down and in what movement. And so, like you said, I know nothing about pitching. I put my foot wrong time on the rubber every time. But because I know where their trunk breaks down in movement capacity, is it single leg? Is it a hinge? Is it in the air? Is it on the ground? I'm able to convey that and turn that into the pitching motion and gather the story with the mobility of how I know she's compensating, what joint is she compensating through, and then where's the breakdown of the trunk. Now I have the athlete's full story. So now I can see, all right, she's not rotating, her trunk's not stable in this position, and here's why. And now we have a game plan in full action, me and you attacking this athlete.
Yeah, and I think like we joke about that you put your wrong foot forward on the rubber all the time when you're demoing, but I do think that's important because what we're not asking strength coaches out there to do is to like understand the biomechanics of pitching. Like It's hard enough to be good at in your own realm. I mean, we're all working every day to become strong coaches and have, high level brain power for our own area. So that I think like it's a joke, but it is important to point out. But having an understanding of like what am I helping them to be able to do and accomplish is really critical. In my mind, like our assessment, it's like the piece of communication that sits between all of us, right? So you can come to me and say, athlete A, this pitcher A, she is really like, what does she look like in the pitching motion? Because when I'm trying to get her in X position, she's really struggling. She does this instead of this. And I say like hands down, like, yep, here's what it looks like in pitching, right? And it's really like the assessment that's allowed us to say, like, the assessment is built upon what needs to translate into the pitching motion. You can see it at its base level, and then I just see its translation at the pitching motion level. I think that's really the power of it, right? It like gets us to speak pitching without you having to know pitching, right?
I mean, we joke all the time about this too, but the assessment is what has turned me into the third skill coach here, honestly. I will have so many athletes on the strength floor. I'll look at them doing a movement, or I'll look over at their assessment before they come in that day just to make sure I'm on board with what we're hammering. And I'll go like, you do this in your swing, so we really need to focus on this movement today. And they're like, you've never seen me hit before, or you've never seen me pitch. And I'm like, I know, but your assessment says this. So it's the assessment's knowledge to constantly know the athlete's story. And that's so powerful for you as a strength coach, and then for you as a coach to know everyone's on the same game plan, and then for the athlete to hear like, the strength coach who's never seen them take a hit or pitch a ball say, well, this is how you look. Then they're like, I'm brought in. You know how I swing. You're like, you must be magic. I don't know how many times I've heard that.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me, we have a level system here. So it's kind of internal. It's not as important for our athletes to know, but it's a way that when we score our assessment, it tells us basically the degree of stability or instability, depending on how you look at it. And so movement capacity dictates that level, right? Mobility, as you say, is just sort of a result of the compensations you've used due to what the trunk does, right? So, okay, so we get a level 1, 2, 3, or 4. Walk us through what those mean and how your brain sort of attacks that. Let me rephrase this. I think that when I get a program, my job is to create an environment where the pitcher can do the motion well, where she can move more optimally. I've talked about this in the first series about, low intensity, different constraints, like low intensity, like different ball weights, different tactile feedback, getting her to understand how the trunk is supposed to move, how the levers are supposed to move. I feel as if programming is about environmental design. You're the same. It just doesn't look like pitching. It's more foundational in movement. So talk to me about that concept and how it relates to the assessment, where the levels even fit in that conversation.
Yeah, so just to go over the levels real quick once again. Level 1 is we're working on stability. Most time novice lifters or new time lifters in this, new athletes. Level 2, we're still building stability. Level 3, we have a solid base of stability. We're adding power. And level 4 is the most stable athlete. Now we're making individual changes to their program to maximize their sport-specific needs. So then when we get that level 1 athlete diving back, we have no stability. The first thing we need to do is build that pelvis, build that pelvic stability. So what this looks like is I need to create an environment that allows that athlete to get into a good position, a squat, a hinge, something along that. And so level 1 is a lot of tactile feedback, a lot of feedback for the athlete to get into this position. So we have box squats that we use. We go hinge to wall. We go isometric holds to get the athlete used to what that muscle tension feels like. And then we keep growing those positions, adding weight, adding longer holds, and working them through the system.
What about, I often see sort of like lower level, I don't want to say lower level athletes because sometimes they're great athletes, but lower level from our assessment standpoint, level 1, level 2 from a trunk stability, like they're on the ground a lot. So they're in like supine positions and such. Like give me an example of why you might be attacking one concept and what that concept would look like with an level 1 athlete where you had to provide her a lot of sort of you provide the stability for her, and maybe how that would evolve and change, progress as you work up to level 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah, so level 1 athlete, anytime we're doing a rowing position, I know this athlete is struggling to maintain lumbopelvic stability. So if I had this athlete provide that stability on their own and go through a row, I know at some point their lower back would get fatigued because they're not maintaining a proper position here. So we're going to put them on the bench and we're going to let them row. We're going to grow volume. We're going to keep gaining strength where we need to, really in that upper body and those scaps. And then once she gets to level 4, we remove the bench because she has this base of stability and now can support herself while doing this. And that is the beauty of the progression through the level system. It just meshes so well and transfers over.
Yeah, and so I think like I'm right now, basically, however you communicate what your programming and your systems are like, I communicate the same way about my systems. It's just I'm pitching your strength and conditioning, but the concepts are the same, right? It's like use the same assessment to identify what the athlete's capacity is and is not currently, right? It can change, of course, for better or for worse, but what it is currently, and build her a program. And so when we identify that, we really like assist her. We give her a lot of feedback. Like really, we don't do a lot of like, challenging athletes, like making them more unstable. We would do that maybe if athletes were like incredibly high level, but the majority of athletes that we really have here, even college athletes, are sitting around like level 2, right? Like when we make the jump of athletes in level 3, it's a big deal because most female athletes are not trained for a lot of the reasons we talked about in episode 1. They're not trained to really start in the trunk, start with the pelvis, get the appropriate stability first. And so like you and I are really just thinking about how do we help them understand stability so that they don't need as much feedback. They can start doing it on their own. Now we progress from there.
Right.
Yeah. I would say, okay, so that's initial assessment. We build out this program, right? We build out this concept of like, what environments are we creating? We have the same assessment to tell us. And now there's this ongoing process. We redo mobility every 4 weeks to see if things are adjusting and changing. We look at movement capacity every 12 weeks, power every 12 weeks. And then we re-sit down and we have a discussion about like, how has this athlete responded to our program, right? So what I think is really interesting is that we kind of know how to divide that. Like our assessment is also an accountability piece. So I have the biomechanics to tell me if the patterns have translated into the pitching motion, right? Also I have ball flight, but the step before that is biomechanics. And you have the reassessment. And so if we see from your program, she's doing so much better, like look how much progress she's made in that 12 weeks on your end in the reassessment, but none of that is translated into her biomechanics, it's on me. It's on my environment. And that doesn't mean I'm a terrible pitching coach. I think that's important for coaches to hear and understand. It just means that like that athlete really is not responding to the environment I built for her. It might have been great in concept, but she didn't respond to it. Versus when we see like, okay, this athlete is not making the progress in our reassessment, like our movement capacity piece, something is going on. Maybe it's on the environment. It could be outside variables, of course. We know we like a health and wellness piece we always talk about, like we look at our athletes' health and wellness. Sometimes they're like, they don't sleep, they're super stressed, they don't eat enough. Like there are concepts we know, but it at least helps us really get back to like, where is the root of why things aren't working? And wouldn't you agree that like, in addition to our assessment, we talk about it being the platform to tell a story. I don't know if we talk enough about its power in holding us accountable, and not just holding us accountable, you're a good coach or a bad coach, but like, where are the pieces not coming together? Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So when you think about programming a new program and the progressions you want to build out, that all sounds great as a strength coach until you see that the athlete's not progressing. You get the assessment back, and maybe next program she's supposed to move up to a barbell split squat, but you see something in the movement capacity that alarms you. And it's like, okay, we need to adapt for the sake of the athlete and find a way to put her in a different environment. And like you said, it doesn't mean you're a bad coach. And it helps my job so much programming to know what should come next instead of what I want to do. Instead of we have this planned out for the year of progressions, because the most perfect progression still can't be a perfect progression with female athletes, with high school athletes, because there's so many confounding variables. I mean, like you said, diet, sleep, those are just a few. We have so many. If you've never heard of it, it's probably here.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think like that's a huge message, right? It's just like this ongoing process of watching. Again, it's not like your program's good, or I mean, like I would venture to say that all the programs you build are great. It doesn't mean all the athletes respond the same way to them. So constantly checking. There have been times where you'll say like, I mean, like this athlete is like looks amazing. I'm now challenging her in this position. Her trunk stability looks great here. Like maybe it's before we've done a reassessment. Like how's it going with you? And I'm like, I'm stuck. I cannot get those concepts. I don't see any change, not even at low intensity. And that's a really important conversation for us to have, because I'm like, she's responding to what Carly's doing, but she's not responding to what I'm doing. So essentially, like, I'll learn from her program with you and be like, okay, well, we've had these circumstances with like coordination and rhythm, right? Like that's a great example of like we've had issues where some pitchers just can't quite establish the stability and the tension where they need to in the center of the body because of the rigidity in their levers, essentially. And so you'll find, put pitching aside, that there's a certain environment or something that you can do that you're like, when I attack this first, it sort of like releases that level of rigidity. And I can't translate it apples to apples, but I can translate it apples to oranges of like, okay, here's what I think I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to add to her program. Here's what I'm going to add to her environment to see if that translates for me. And I have to say, maybe some of the most like Dr. House stories we've ever had is really that concept of like, it's translating in one way, but it doesn't go to the skill. And like, I've got to come to you about like, what's the concept behind what you're doing there? Maybe can you talk a little bit about like some other case studies where like you and I have gone back and forth, or maybe you've seen like, you've walked over to the bullpen and I'm like, Car, this is where like here's why we need her to be able to do this. And you're like, okay, I'm going to try this.
Yeah, so one case study that we've been through the absolute ringer with, I'll go over to the bullpen so many times and I just watch her load with you. I'm like, I've got to find a way to get her into a better position. But I'm constantly monitoring her on the strength floor, and I'm thinking her patterns look great. What she's doing is great. And then I go to the bullpen and I watch her for a second and see these patterns. I'm like, I could be doing things so much better. Like, yes, it's great. Like you said before, the program can be great itself, but the aspect of transferring over to skill is what really matters. And it's when I'm watching bullpen sessions or when I hear you talk about this athlete, how she did movement prep, how she's compensating in her motion, that I'm like, you know what? Here's what we need to add to the warm-up. Or there's been times where you've come to me and you've almost demanded, here's what I want in the warm-up. Can you write something like this?
Yeah.
And I think those have also been the most successful stories. Those have been the cases where the athlete has, I think, gotten the most potential out of us.
Yeah. I demand because I'm demanding. But in reality, we're a team. And I think like that's really the root of this conversation and this series is like you and I, we are a team. So it's not like when the assessment tells me that it's broken down in my end, you're like, haha, I did my job. Like it's like, okay, Carly's figured something out that like I haven't translated to the pitching motion. Like, how are we working together? I think that's the concept of being like a third skill coach. When you talk about this concept of like I walk over the bullpen and I see like something is still off, can you give me like a specific either like movement or exercise where you've progressed it, you've challenged it, you've changed it, either like I've got to add something to it to make it look a little more like pitching? Is there like, just to kind of, to give the listeners out there a little bit of context of like what an example of that would look like?
So the case study we're talking about in particular, I walked up to the bullpen, watched her load the full session of pitching, and I was just like, shoot, the way I've been loading her in the hinge, it's probably not the best way. So she was actually loading the wrong sling as she was working through pitching. I was like, there's something we can do better here. So we kept working on hinging on the strength floor, but I changed the way that I was loading her to load the opposite sling. And so this is as simple as just changing the hand that holds the weight. So if I'm holding the weight on the opposite side while doing a single leg RDL or a single leg supported RDL, then I'm going to change the sling. So it's something as simple as that helps the athlete. So it's not a big change. It's a gradual change like that. It can really go a long way.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful change. I think that's important. It's like, it's not a big change, but it's a huge change actually. Like it's a small change in actuality, but like what it could translate to is really, really huge. I think, a big part of this concept of what we want to get across is, again, not just like we see the same assessment and we build the same program, we build a program around that, but the ongoing conversation, right? The ongoing conversation of like, is her movement quality going up? What should I be expecting her to be able to do on the strength floor, in the bullpen? Obviously, then I have a piece of like, patterns should then translate to ball flight. So from my standpoint of a pitching coach, I'm looking at whatever capacity you're helping her to grow. Am I doing a good enough job with building an environment where now that's finding its way into the pitching motion? And are those patterns changing, influencing ball flight the way I know, is really like in our goals and what we're trying to achieve? So that's really how the story goes along. And like this Dr. House concept is this ever evolving, ever changing conversation, right? And like time of year, like the challenges for our athletes, like when they're in season, when they're out of season, if they play in other sports, we probably will have a whole episode on like what we have found with athletes who are multi-sport athletes, even though everyone thinks that sounds amazing, what we actually find here. But we have these conversations. It's just like there are no two athletes in an identical situation. So that ongoing conversation and just our ability to go back to the root and the heart of the assessment to really like quantitatively be able to measure like are patterns progressing, is the program working? Again, not an indication of like good coach, bad coach, but more of like go back to the drawing board. We can do more for this athlete.
Absolutely.
Okay, Cars, just to wrap up here, I would say, you mentioned in the first episode, like your brain has evolved so much from the standpoint of since working here, like I'm a third skill coach. When you are looking at right now, like when we have college athletes come to us, either we're on the road for college athletes, what we're actually finding is that most of the college athletes we're assessing, again, either on the road or when they come here, are very similar as far as like how they score in our assessment process. And I think that's been really telling for us of just sort of like, we got to start to have better conversations about how we should be training our athletes. It's partially on us in a pitching culture and a softball community on sort of like the demands we're placing on our athletes, but it's also this conversation of like the strength world has got to bring it up, right? Like we've got to meet in the middle with how to train. What are your hopes as we continue to build out this series of the podcast? What are your hopes and what are the things that you feel like the trajectory as far as where we should be shooting as far as the strength and conditioning world for softball athletes, for pitchers, to start to move up so that that's not the case? We clearly see that like our college athletes are better movers than our high school athletes because that's the way it should be.
I would say it's to recognize softball and highlight the individual needs that it demands of movement. I mean, it is so high level. Rotation is such a high level movement that my hope and wish is that is recognized and taken into account at that level, but then also into the individual level of giving these kids the resiliency to be the best that they can be, to counter injury and come back just like that because they are resilient, and not treat softball players as this fragile or just another powerful sport. The game is changing, right? So the game is going to start demanding higher level athletes, and that is going to start demanding higher level strength and conditioning programs. And I think that is kicked off here.
Yeah, and I think we didn't talk about this, but this concept of like, a lot of the injury issues that we're seeing at the high school level and in the college level, I think it's just a real indication of this sort of, the strength world and the softball or the pitching training world not really being on the same page. So I hope that even these initial discussions that we're having here really just help kickstart like how to create a better system around the athletes. We cannot say it enough. We talked about our assessment process today, how it serves as a communication piece between us. It serves as sort of like the initial piece that helps build the programs. But you mentioned it a couple times, Carly, the individual level. And I understand that for some strength coaches out there, like you only have so much capacity. I think that's something sort of when you spin off your own podcast that's, specifically targeted towards strength coaches, you could start to discuss like how do you take one strength coach who's assigned to 3 teams and create some sort of like individuality to their programs. But the reality is like we have to start seeing in that way. If the whole team is doing exactly the same thing and they're in college or they're higher level high school, again, we mentioned this in episode 1, but if like the football team and the sprinters and your softball players are doing very similar things, like these are the questions we've got to start to ask from a baseline level, and then to understand that like don't just follow progressions for each athlete. Like now you're on this week, you're on this week. Have a system where feedback is given to you, quantitative feedback is given to you about like, can the environment be better? Can the environment actually do something more for this athlete? Would you say in summary, that is just sort of like the message we would give about kind of reevaluating, reassessing our athletes here at S2?
It is absolutely the message that I would be giving to our athletes. Having a plan is one thing, but then to see that plan torn up into a million pieces is another thing. But we're able to navigate that. So it's all about being able to navigate the journey, which is a system that we've set up.
Yeah, it's awesome. Okay, thanks to everyone for joining. That's a wrap on episode 2, series 2. Carly, again, thank you for your brain power, your expertise, for joining us here, Redefine the Circle. Looking forward to seeing you next week on episode 3. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.